Class 1 at the South Devon Rudolf Steiner School. Only now, aged 6 to 7, are the children starting formally to learn to read and write. And like much of the teaching in Steiner schools, music and art are incorporated into the lessons throughout childhood. The South Devon School is one of 35 Steiner Waldorf schools in Britain. The first Waldorf school was founded by Steiner in 1919 at the request of Emil Molt, owner of the Waldorf cigarette factory in Stuttgart, who wanted an education for the children of his employees that prepared them for life in its fullest sense. And life in its fullest sense means educating hands and heart as well as head. Until the children go into Class 1 around the age of 7, the emphasis is on play, imitation and on rhythm. Baking on Monday, painting on Wednesday, an expedition on Thursday and so on. And on stories which are told rather than read by the teacher. And Steiner's picture of child development is not only of children growing up and thereby learning the ways of the world, but also of children growing down, bringing into life their own unique biographies, as he saw it from many lifetimes. And this needs time to build a strong and firm foundation so that each child can not only then face the world as it is, but also develop the strength of character to maybe change it. Songs and ring games are another important ingredient in the early years. Ideally, dexterity in their bodies will gradually translate into dexterity in how they think and create. Much of what the children do, not just in the kindergarten, is designed to counteract what is increasingly recognized in the modern world as an erosion of childhood. A concern that extends far beyond the Waldorf school movement. As at the Brighton Steiner School, these 9-year-olds are also not just studying farming, but actually doing it as part of what is called main lesson. One particular subject taught for the first 2 hours every morning over a period of 3 or 4 weeks. Around this age, most children start to take a new interest in the world around them, whilst also experiencing a certain separation from that world. Now they begin to study science, and in mathematics the concept of fractions.
Still waiting for science. Now, who remembers which are those potatoes from the ones we planted? Are they early? Only early? Lily? First early, thank you. What else have we got here?
Main crop.
Main crop? Yeah, what else? Lily, May?
Early the second.
Phrase that differently?
Second early.
Thank you. Who can show me blight in this potato? Lily, show something to me. Can you see? I can see from where I am. Quite right. Yeah? Every digger should have 2 other ones working together. So should be groups of 3. A digger and 2 collecting the potatoes. The plants should all be brought back here, please. Yeah, girls? That's perfect. No, that's fine. So one on this side. You are too many here.
Well, they really seem to be enjoying themselves. I thought children weren't meant to like gardening.
They like gardening very much because they can see the end result. So they've been involved in the ploughing of this field, well, spreading the muck, the ploughing of the field, which was done by horses. So they actually pulled the plough. So they had, what is that?
Can we see the lamb?
Soon. Yeah?
That's a big one.
How many?
7.
Very gentle.
9.
Whoa, wow, look at that.
14. 16.
They respond very well to the activities we propose. It's the practical ones there. Yes, let's do it. And there's a real enthusiasm that comes from them.
Where are you from?
I'm from Brazil.
Brazil.
I'm from Brazil, yeah.
So there are Waldorf schools in Brazil too.
There are Waldorf schools in Brazil,
Yeah.
but I wasn't connected to schools there. I was connected to the biodynamic impulse, but not to schools.
Here you're doing both.
That's right, yeah, sort of bringing them together, really. Yeah.
Andre is also helping this class to build a stall from which they can sell the vegetables. Building is another subject taught at this age: planning, measuring and execution.
Let's make a pile over there, okay? Down there.
The curriculum in Steiner schools is designed to introduce subjects when they resonate and correspond to where the child is at in his or her development. Insight into what you teach when, and a recognition of distinct 7-year phases in child development were two of Steiner's special contributions to education.
What is this, Declan?
That's to support, that's to attach the two poles together to make them both steady.
Yeah, and what else? Jude?
Also, so when we put the roof on, you don't have to put it exactly on the top of the pole, we can put it on the sign bit.
Does it hold up the roof?
Well, it will. Like Jude said, what will be sitting here? That some of
But not all teaching in Steiner schools takes place outdoors. Biology is the main lesson subject for Class 6 for the next 3 weeks. From Class 1 to 8, the children who are unstreamed have the same teacher for these main lesson subjects, whether it be science, history, mathematics or geography. These key subjects form the core of the Waldorf curriculum.
How does the queen ant start to establish her colony after she's mated with the drone on her nuptial flight? Aggie?
She digs a hole and then carries all the earth out of the hole so she can have more space to dig.
Excellent, thank you.
Alexa Smith will stay with this group of children until they go into the upper school around the age of 15. This can mean the children having the same class teacher for 8 years, ideally creating a bond between teacher and pupils that goes way beyond the actual knowledge imparted. For the rest of the school day, the children will be taught by specialist teachers, languages, games, crafts, etc. I asked the teacher of Class 2 what attracted parents to their school.
Well, I think there are an awful lot of parents who come to our schools and sense that what's there is wholesome and good for the children, and they're looking for, childhood with all the light and joy that childhood brings, and quite often seeing in many schools that children in a way trying to be moulded into something which isn't child friendly, and they see that in our schools, we celebrate childhood and we try to bring things which actually really nurture and nourish and feed where the children are actually at, and so they'll see that, they'll sense that, and then they bring their children. And I think it's up to us to make what we do available and understandable in terms which don't make people feel that it's something weird that's behind it. Because I firmly believe it is not something weird. The sun with loving light makes bright for me each day. The soul with spirit power gives strength unto my limbs. I've been doing this for 20 years, and it really does nurture and nourish those children, and they are free afterwards. They're not coming out having to believe in any particular belief system or anything. They're totally free, but they've been nourished as human beings.
Ian Powell teaches art and the history of art as well as drama to the upper school. Although there tend to be no internal exams in Steiner Waldorf schools, the pupils do take state examinations. I asked Ian about the word results a label that is increasingly associated with a school's performance and success.
For me, there's no such thing. One of the frustrations, if you think about that as a frustration, is that I will never see the results of my work until they come back to me when they're at least over 35 or 42. And that's from a strong belief that they are continually growing. I mean, to think that a young person is only a summation of the results of, if it's GCSEs or A-levels or even a degree, if that's all that the person is, that really is a very slight on the individual, because we all know that, in fact, you're still developing. So I'm really well aware that anything I do here, if it's an examinable, is purely to allow them to go on to the next phase of study. It has nothing to do with the result. No, again, time. Victor! How'd you come with about? Bobby! Oh!
I then asked Ian how he related, as a teacher, to what Steiner said and wrote about karma and reincarnation.
I think subliminally, as a teacher, when you've been working long enough, I think what starts to happen is you realise there's more to this young person than just the face value that you're seeing or the what can become. There's something that they're bringing with them. Yes, there's hereditary, that's true too. There's the family, there's their society, but there's something else, and you become aware of there's something else very often. One doesn't look at it or dwell on it or try to research it because it's not within our remit to do so, but you're certainly aware that there's another tool, there's another something there that's happening that needs resolution or needs to be resolved, or that you allow the young person to perceive through doing the activities that we do. They don't see it as karma, of course, but maybe when they're 35, 42, something might happen in their lives that they think, I was dealing with something that I had to work out at that age, even though I didn't know it.
The school's doctor is James Dyson. In addition to his orthodox medical qualifications, he has made an in-depth study of Steiner's medically related lectures and writings, and of the considerable research that these insights have inspired into a greater understanding of the human being. In Gauguin's words, what are we? I asked James how these other perspectives informed his work as a doctor.
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? Well, just looking out of the window just now, what I was particularly interested in was observing movement, how children move. And I think that's as good a place to start as any, because movement speaks the language, not just in the ordinary neurological sense, but movement and gesture speak the language of the soul, they speak the language of development. They show us how a child is relating to the environment, for instance. And nowadays, particularly, harmonious movement is often the exception rather than the rule.
And why is this happening?
I think that young children nowadays are subject to a far higher level of sensory stimulation than they were in the past, from a much earlier age. Be it in the form of IT and screens, or in other ways too. And at the same time, children are deprived of the kind of traditional possibilities of movement through which, your average child was exposed 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Waldorf schools are almost unique in not introducing computers until the upper school, and then only gradually. Many parents and educationalists these days share their view that early childhood should be less focused on information technology and generally less pressured.
The key theme of what Steiner brought as a picture for child development, namely that up until neurological maturity has reached a certain level, in the 6th, 7th year of life, you should not tax the nervous system cognitively, but you should work very much with the faculty of imitation and creative play and stimulate that.
And for what reason? Why shouldn't you tax the brain? I mean, that's what you're talking about, isn't it?
I think the simplest way of putting it is that if you're still laying the tracks for the tram line, you don't drive the tram along.
Rudolf Steiner himself grew up beside railway lines. His father was a station master, and the exciting new world of trains was ever present. Steiner was 2 years old when, in 1863, his father was transferred to this station at Potsdam in Lower Austria. He lived here until he was 8. Steiner wrote in his autobiography of his deep appreciation for the unspoiled landscape in which he grew up. Despite the new technology on his doorstep, life for the young boy was essentially simple. Simple, but far from cosy. Here, Steiner lived not only in the two worlds of trains and nature, both of which he loved, but also in an inner world of spiritual experiences that were as real to him as the physical world around him. Already around the age of 7, he had a vivid experience of a relative who had just committed suicide and who asked him for help. But it was to be almost 40 years before he could speak openly about such matters. What is the true nature of reality? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? These were questions that were to occupy Rudolf Steiner for the rest of his life. In 1868, the family moved nearer to Vienna, to the village of Neudorf. By now, Steiner had a younger brother and sister. Though less remote than Potsdam, his home was still, in Steiner's words, austere but healthy. He served as an altar boy at the local Catholic church, helped grow vegetables for the family, but the essence of his journey through childhood and youth, that long walk to school, was the story of a very bright but essentially lonely child, nudged by his father to study science and technology to qualify as an engineer on the railways, who was nevertheless thinking deeply about what he called the enigmas of existence, and already at the age of 14 studying the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. In 1879, at the age of 18, he passed his school leaving examination with distinction. For 3 years he'd given private tuition to fellow pupils in order, he wrote, to contribute at least a little of what my parents had to pay out of their meagre income for my schooling. And having attended a technical rather than a grammar school, he had had to teach himself Latin and Greek. From the Austrian countryside in which Steiner had grown up, as the son of a humble railway official, the move to Vienna was a huge step. Capital of the vast Habsburg Empire, it was a cosmopolitan city buzzing with life, creativity, and philosophical debate. A cultural flowering on a massive scale. In the autumn of that same year, Steiner enrolled at the Technical University to study biology, chemistry, physics, and mathematics. But already his interests were as much in German philosophy and literature as in science. Very soon his social life began to flourish. The famous Café Greensteidl, which for a time he gave as his address, is now more a tourist attraction than a hive of philosophical debate. But round the corner at this nearby coffee house, it is easier to imagine the atmosphere of that era and the extraordinary variety of people with whom the young Steiner was mixing. Poets, rich merchants, Cistercian monks, feminists, university professors, and poor students like himself. I asked 2 young customers, both of whom knew something about Steiner's life and legacy, whether the sort of discussions that Steiner and others had in coffee houses like this one were a thing of the past.
Those dialogues, really to sit hours and hours, yeah, and to develop an idea. I think you can't find that in that way anymore.
Do you think that's sad?
In a way, yes, because I'm old-fashioned. But I'm quite open to new ways of dialogues. Yeah?
Yeah.
And I think especially the communication through the net is an enormous chance. Yeah.
Opportunity. Yeah.
Opportunity.
Yeah. 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 So you're optimistic about the future in that sense, are you?
I'm very optimistic. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to me, the idea, it's always a question: how would Steiner act in those days? Yeah, would he use the internet or not? I think he would.
Yes,
Definitely.
yeah.
He would be very, very open to our ways and our chances and our opportunities to communicate, to develop, to work together.
Not everyone interested in Steiner's work would agree with Bipper about Steiner and the internet, not only because he, like many others, recognized that technological advances, ever since the printing press, were no replacement for face-to-face human encounters, but also that the mindset behind such devices could, if we remain unconscious, take us on a slippery slope in which our entire world gradually becomes dehumanized. What Steiner made clear, however, is that all such decisions have finally to rest with the individual.
His main message, especially to me, was or is that he wants us to stand up for our own ideas. And that's, especially in our time, not that easy. So for people, it's much more easy to put him into a box than to focus his message and follow the message. And I think he didn't want us to follow him. He wanted us to follow ourselves.
Although Steiner had an increasingly wide circle of friends, he was at the same time following his own inner voice. But, like all of us, he needed his awakeners, people who actually change your life. On his regular train journey from home into Vienna, he met such a person, a man with whom he could at last share his inner life of spiritual experiences. Felix Kogusky was a herbalist who travelled into Vienna to sell to apothecaries the medicinal herbs he'd gathered in the countryside. On his back, wrote Steiner in his autobiography, were his bundles of herbs, but in his heart was the knowledge of the spiritual aspects of nature that had come to him through gathering them. Through Felix, Steiner learned that there existed a vast store of traditional wisdom that was soon to disappear completely from the folk culture of Central Europe. In his company, Steiner felt in touch with what he called a soul from ancient times, someone with the intuitive knowledge that he himself had experienced since childhood, and which he was already trying to understand and above all to anchor in the world of modern-day consciousness. But there was another ingredient that Steiner was to increasingly emphasize. For every step that we take in our search for this deeper wisdom, we need to take 3 steps in our moral development. A person should not be on this journey, he wrote some 25 years later, to accumulate learning as one's own treasure of knowledge, but in order to place this learning in the service of the world. Meanwhile, the young Steiner was to experience another great awakener, a man who was also to profoundly influence the course of his life. Among the great personalities of the German-speaking world, both past and present, he became inspired by the work of the literary giant Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who had died some 50 years earlier. Not Goethe just as poet and novelist, but Goethe as scientist, particularly his work in anatomy, optics, and botany. Later, Steiner was to call him the Copernicus and the Kepler of the organic world.
Goethe was a huge influence on Steiner, and Steiner felt that he discovered a kindred spirit in Goethe, because he was approaching the natural world with an open heart, and not as an object to be studied and measured and quantified, but rather as a world that was still imbued with something sacred. I think Goethe was very aware of the sacredness of nature, and that's why he wanted to approach it in a different way, with empathy, rather than with objectifying consciousness.
But he still thought of himself as a scientist, didn't he, Goethe?
He certainly did, because he was interested in knowledge, and in a type of knowledge that was a direct knowing, really a perceiving, to actually see into the spiritual workings of nature. So he was focused much more on the world of qualities than of quantities, and much more on what could be perceived by each person as a human being, unaided by any scientific instruments. So for him, scientific instruments tended to get in the way of really seeing what was living in nature. That's why he's so much at odds with the approach of mainstream science.
Jeremy Nadler is a writer with a doctorate in theology and religious studies who makes his living as a gardener in Oxford.
For Goethe, the human being is the most exact instrument. If you can develop that instrument into an organ of deep perception, then of course you'll see more and more in nature, and that's what Steiner was able to do. He developed himself as a spiritual instrument, I suppose. So he was perceiving much more than most people are able to perceive in the natural world, and he extended that to invisible worlds, of course.
And was pointing to the fact that we all have this potential then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not so easy to develop it, though.
No.
But, you know, one just has to keep working at it, really on a daily basis.
What is your understanding of the key to working with it then?
Well, when I go into the gardens, I'm very aware that the first thing I want to do is, I see weeds and, you know, and I see all sorts of things that need doing. So I want to get engaged with practical stuff. But I try to stop myself and just spend at least a few minutes with a plant and just observe it, just be with it. And there's something immensely centering and healing in doing that. And I feel it actually helps the rest of my day in the garden. You realize that there's a miracle there, really. And it's so easy to not see it.
Yeah. But that would be true perhaps of life altogether. We just simply don't notice things, do we? We take things for granted.
Yeah.
Not just plants.
That's absolutely true of life altogether. And one of the wonderful things about Goethe's scientific method is that you can apply it to every life situation. It's not just to do with our relationship to nature. It's not just to do with looking at plants or whatever. It's to do with how you relate to people, having an openness of heart, really.
Goethe does provide a kind of transition, a foundation for a transition between, I might say, conventional day consciousness and what Steiner calls ultimately his spiritual science. That is to say, a way of engaging the world of spirit, the world of our own inner experiences, with as much surety and clarity as we do the outer world. I'm going to remind you of what we saw at the very beginning of our class. Remember, there was a little Wimshurst machine here that allows us to do something very similar, slightly different geometry, but basically a similar kind of...
Arthur Zients is professor of physics at Amherst College, Massachusetts. Alongside his interest in Steiner, and through his connection with the work of the Dalai Lama, he is a pioneer in bringing the practice of meditation into academic circles. I asked Arthur to explain the young Steiner's interest in the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and in particular Steiner's rejection of Kant's hugely influential utterances on the limits to knowledge.
The limits, the so-called limits to knowledge, are really the limits of a horizon. You know, if you stand on a mountaintop, you see further than if you're down in the valley. Well, but you got to get to the mountaintop, right? So yes, you could say there are limits to knowledge if you're in a particular location, but there's nothing to keep you from developing yourself to a higher extent. It's like climbing the mountain and seeing further. There'll still be a horizon, so you'll still experience a limit, but the limit is a subjective limit, not an objective statement about the way the world is organized. So yes, you could say Steiner recognized that there are, in the moment, certain limits to knowledge, but that these are not part of our human nature. Human nature is, in some ways, inexhaustible. Everything that can be known by the human being. We are, in that sense, in the image of God. We're filled with the potential for the most profound and extraordinary way of knowing.
From Steiner's point of view, a human being stands in the world and the world's impressions come through the senses, green, movement, light, warmth, hardness, all that sort of stuff. And that's given to us. We don't do anything about that. I don't create that tree. The tree's all given there. But I, as a human being, also act into it because I bring the concept tree, green, the relationship of that tree, the kind of tree that is related to that another tree, and so on. All that is a human product in relationship to what's given to me. So you have a given world and a world that's the product of human thinking. And these two interacting give us what we call the real world. So it isn't a world we can never know. It's not always immediately known, but it's not in its essence unknowable.